Hello, everyone, and welcome to Birth and Baby Talk. This week, we are talking to pediatric occupational therapist Kaili Etz, right?
Yep.
And Kaili works with infants and children in a variety of capacities, including occupational therapy and cranial sacral therapy. And she often helps families with their sleep journeys as well. And I thought it would be awesome to talk to her about how babies process sensory information, what that is, and how it can affect a baby's whole life, and how occupational therapy or cranial sacral therapy can help improve things for some babies with challenges. So, welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So, why don't we start and talk about the senses? Now, we're all familiar with the five senses, like taste, touch, smell. Oh my goodness, that's three sounds.
Hearing. Yeah, so you did the taste, touch, smell, hearing, and taste, touch, smell,
right?
Hearing. We did smell, taste, touch, smell, hear. Oh my God. Whoa, wait a second. Hang on.
Sight.
Tactile, vision, seeing.
Okay, so most of us are mostly familiar with the five senses, but there's actually more than those, right?
There are. So those are sort of our five external senses. And we actually have three internal senses. So we have the vestibular sense, which is housed in the inner ear. And that is really our movement and our balance sense. That sense is what tells us where our body is against gravity. And that sense is triggered whenever we have our head moving. So when we're moving back and forth, up and down, side to side, spinning and upside down, then there's different parts of that vestibular sense that get triggered. And those tell us where our body is against gravity. Okay. Then we have the proprioceptive sense, which actually works very closely with the vestibular sense also. The proprioceptive sense is like our muscles and our joints. And that is what tells me where my body is in space and where my body parts are in space. And so that's the piece that tells me, oh, I'm falling. So the vestibular sense is like, whoa, you're falling. And the proprioceptive sense is like, okay, muscles, joints, activate, get yourself upright.
Or how I knew where I don't even have to look at my cup and I know that it's close to my body because of where my arm is. And okay.
Because I know that my right hand, well, I can see it in the screen, but if I was not looking at it, I know where my hand is just because it's moving, right? I don't have to look at it. And so what happens, so that's the second sense. And then the third sense is the interoception sense. So that's really like our internal senses, like hunger, thirst, bowel kind of senses, also sleep and wake kind of senses of like when we're tired, when we're not. If there's any sort of organ things going on and there's any discomfort, then it's all those internal senses.
Okay.
And so that's our interoception sense as well. So you can see that it's a lot more than just those five senses. And all of these things really work together because everything that comes into our body from the environment, we learn through our senses. So we see it, we hear it, we taste it, we touch it, we feel it, right? And so our body has to take in that information from the environment. And it has to figure out what to do with that information. Yeah. And sometimes that process of getting from the different receptors up into the brain doesn't go as smoothly and as efficiently as we would like it to. And so there is sort of a disconnect that happens. And then that can potentially lead to sensory processing differences or difficulties or concerns or issues or whatever you want to call them. I like differences because oftentimes, none of us have perfect sensory processing. We all have our little nuances, right? We all have things that we're like, oh, I don't really like the feeling of eggplant, for example. I am not an eggplant eater. For some reason, it is just too mushy or something. There's something about it And it's not even just that specific mushy texture, because I eat things that are mushy. It's just eggplant. So, but we all have our things, and then you just deal with it.
Yeah.
But what happens is, especially for our babies and kids, but adults too, they don't know how to deal with those differences that just don't feel quite right.
Yeah.
They don't have the ability to say, "No, mom, I don't like the eggplant," right? Um, and so this is when we start to get into sort of more of those sensory processing differences that then affect function. Oh, did I freeze? Can you still hear me? Because you are
I
frozen.
can
Are
hear
we
you.
on a
I can
lag?
hear you.
I
There's a little bit of
think I
choppiness, but
froze.
you're okay.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay. 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 And so these sensory processing differences, and when it comes to a little bit more significant in terms of that sensory processing disorder, that's when it really is like affecting function. So affecting
Mhm.
a baby's function, a child's function, or even affecting like family routines and the function as a family and whole as a whole. So if you find yourself like, we can do a lot for our kids, and we do a lot of accommodating for them and
Yeah.
compensating for them. But if you're finding that you're compensating so much that it's like starting to affect your family routines and your family life, and just the way that your family is in terms of like being calm and happy and content and all of that stuff, it's really affecting those family routines. That's when you really are like, something's going on. Let's see if we can really start to work at, helping the sensory processing system work a little bit better. When it's just, oh, well, they just, need to wear super soft, 100% organic cotton, fine, right? Then you just deal with that. It's not necessarily affecting function.
Yes.
So we're talking now about when it is affecting function and what it can sort of look like.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to
And
just keep
so
going, or you have questions? Because I can talk about this for a long time.
I know, right? I love a woman who has such a deep passion and knowledge. I feel like the same with certain topics. I'm always warning anytime I'm teaching, I warn my students that I have to set alarms or I'll talk all day about the subject. But yeah, so when it's, I'm a knitter and I get a lot of people telling me like, oh, I can't wear wool. And I think you're being a bit fancy, aren't you? But but no, it's
I'm
really
one of those people. I can feel if there is like 1% wool in something.
oh, interesting. And so, or the same thing with scents. I remember we were recently had a conversation with a colleague in a professional group, and they were talking about scent being in a space and how people with certain sensitivities can like pick up on the fact that someone had sprayed scent in the room and it's still sticking to the walls like days after the actual scent was released in the space. And so usually if I walk in a room and I go, oh, these scents in this room are a little too much, and I'm kind of reacting, maybe I get a little bit of a sinus reaction or I get a bit of a headache, that might be transitory and not the worst thing in the world. But if I have to live in a space where I have a migraine headache every day triggered by these scents, then that's going to interrupt my life. Or with a baby, right? When we have a small baby who, they just seem to cry an awful lot. And we've given a name to the unknowable, time where these babies like cry an incredible amount for months at a time, every day of the week, which can extremely negatively impact family life in general. We call that colic. Which, is if anyone doesn't know that the insider joke is colic is a 5-letter word for, I don't know what's going on with your baby. But really, those babies might be incredibly sensitive to certain stimuli like light or a sound in the space that they're living in. And here's the other thing I recently learned about is that they might be sensitive in a particular way that they're not getting enough sensation?
Yes. So there's a spectrum, right?
Mhm.
It's sort of a spectrum of how we process sensory information also. And you can be, ideally we're kind of like in the middle and they don't really bother us and we're noticing that they come in
Yeah.
and we can deal with it, right? And sometimes you'll have babies, of course, we all know what you just described is those babies that are super sensitive. And when they are super sensitive, those senses, the information that's coming in is literally seen by their primitive brain as like, oh my gosh, it's a threat. I
Okay.
need to get into survival mode. And they go into that stress response of like fight or flight,
Oh.
sympathetic survival mode, right?
Mhm.
Because their body is viewing that sense, it's over registering that input that's coming in. And it's like, alert, 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 alert. Oh my gosh, we need to survive. We need to do something. So, like, all of the physiological processes start playing into, I have to survive, right? So, that stress response, which
Mhm.
also then increases cortisol, which
Yeah.
then is going to make, calming down, falling asleep, all of those things harder, right?
Mhm.
And also, when you're in a stressed state, you're not focused on feeding and just relaxing, right? You're focused on
Yeah.
fighting or fleeing, or sometimes if that doesn't calm down, you can go into that freeze response as well.
Okay.
And so sometimes on the other end of the spectrum, we have those
Oh, we're having a moment of freeze.
babies and
Go.
individuals in general. Put is coming in through one of those senses. Oh,
Okay.
did we miss something? Because I just saw myself freeze again. It's so weird because I have full bars. um, so I was talking about how there's the other end of the spectrum where they're not actually really noticing that input is even coming in. Where I find this a lot is, babies will maybe just kind of like lay there or sit there or like not really engage with their environment because they're just like, I don't really know what's going on. And parents don't necessarily pick up on it because they're like, oh, my baby is so calm and they're just
Mhm.
they're not really any bother, and like they're just like there, and they don't really cry and they don't do any of these other things, but they're also not moving. They're also not exploring. They're
Yeah.
also not really engaging with their environment or the people in their environment. So that's also a little bit of a red flag.
Mhm.
And then on the other end of that too, as babies start to get older, sometimes these are the babies who are like really active and they're just bouncing off the walls. I mean,
Hyper
they're
aroused.
little babies, so like they can't really necessarily run around everywhere, but they're climbing and they're moving and they're constantly wiggling and they're doing all of these things because they're actually trying to get more input into their system so
Oh,
that they can feel where their body is. They
yeah.
could be like, oh, yeah, here I am. Now I know. Otherwise, it kind of feels like they're just floating in the air. They want to feel grounded. They want to feel calm. They want to feel where their body is in the environment. And
Mm.
so they're constantly moving to try to get that input in to be like, okay, now I know where my body is. But if I'm
Yeah.
still, I can't feel it. And so that's under registering the input.
How in the world do we figure out whether a baby is being overstimulated or understimulated in order to figure out how to then give them what they need?
Yeah. So it's hard with babies. I
Yeah.
will be honest, right? And I do have a sort of sensory processing red flags checklist for babies, but you'll notice that a lot of those things on that checklist could also be other things like feeding difficulties, sleeping difficulties. Those could also be other things. It could be latch issues, tongue tie issues, increased air in their belly. It could be overtiredness because they have been up for way too long and that's why they're, having more broken sleep. So it's not just that these symptoms are like end all be all sensory processing. I
Okay.
find that oftentimes for myself too, is sensory processing is always something I'm looking at and thinking about. But usually it's like you've tried these other things and they're not quite working the way you thought they were going to. There's still some issues. You're still like, well, that didn't really fix things.
Mhm.
What else is going on? And that's where I then come in. Those are the clients that I get who have tried all of the things and they're like, nothing is working. And we've gotten the, tongue released, we've gotten the sleep consultants, we've worked with this, we've done all of the things, and still our child there's something.
Yeah.
They're not able to calm, they're constantly moving. I'm exhausted, they're exhausted, help. And that's when I come in and I start looking at the sensory processing side of things. So it's hard for me to say this means that it's sensory processing.
Yeah.
But what you do want to start watching is you want to start watching your baby's cues. And there are signs when baby is getting overstimulated, things like they're zoning out, or they sort of have like a blank stare. They might start to fuss or cry more. They might become more clingy. All of these also sound like tired cues, don't they?
They do. Like the whole just turning away, avoiding eye contact, tucking the head into the parent.
Exactly. So that's where you kind of want to start playing detective. And you're going to start thinking like, okay, it kind of looks like my baby might be tired. How long has it been since they had a last nap? Or, what might be going on? Have we been really, really busy? Is it time for their nap? And you're like, well, no, they just woke up half an hour ago, right?
Yeah.
And so you're thinking, okay, well, it's not time for their nap. Oh, but we are at the grocery store and it is really busy today. And there's lots of bright lights and there's lots of noises in the environment. Oh, I wonder, maybe my baby is starting to become more fussy because they're actually overstimulated. They've had too much bombardment of the sensory processing or these sensory inputs. So what you can do is you can just say, okay, you know what? Either if you're in line to pay, fine, go and pay. But you can just leave the grocery store, go for a little walk. Usually in the carrier is great because babies will calm and settle when they're nice and close to you because they regulate off of us. It's called co-regulation or synchrony sometimes. And so you can go for a walk and see if they just calm and settle that way. Right?
I really love a
stimulation.
carrier for the fact that, and we always recommend babies like face inward because then they have the greatest amount of control over stimulation because then they can just tuck their head in and kind of hide and block out the rest of the world and go into that nice, fuzzy, safe space.
Yes.
Until they are regulated.
Yeah. Exactly. And so this is where you're playing that detective. You're thinking about your environment. You're thinking about, well, what's going on? Okay, my baby just started fussing. What were we just doing? Did they start fussing because I was holding them a certain way? Or was I changing their clothes? Was I putting on some sleep sack thing? Those kinds of things. Do they fuss every time that I put them on this mattress with these sheets on it? Right? Because it could be if you have tactile sensitivities. I mean, skin is our largest organ and skin is literally like we have touch receptors all over the place.
Yeah.
We also have touch receptors that are sort of underneath the skin too. They're in the sort of joints and the muscles as well, the deep touch. But if you think about having a baby with possible tactile sensitivities or touch sensitivity, they don't like to be held.
No.
They don't, they might fuss because every time they move on the sheets, it feels weird. They don't like the feeling. Their system is going into that threat, like, whoa, high alert. So they're waking themselves up.
I was just with clients who were talking to me about like the dad was saying, what about, we were talking about when a baby asks for something, we try to give it to them in a timely fashion as best we can. So if a baby is crying, we want to attend to their needs to make sure, are you fed? Are you warm? Are you dry? Are you lonesome? Do you need to like hang out with someone? And when we know all of those things, all of those needs have been met, then we can kind of go, all right, like, I guess maybe you just need to cry it out for a little bit because very young babies especially do sometimes need to cry to just sort of get their wiggles out, like like an older child might need to just fuss around a bit to get their energy out. Little babies sometimes cry to get that energy out. But he was saying, like, is there something to, like, like maybe toughen a baby up, like to like give them like exposure therapy and sort of like make them go through slightly tough, stressful things in order to get over them. And I said, like, no, like that might work for older adults. And he said, where I'm coming from is we have friends who they have a daughter who's like 11 months old and she will not put her feet on the carpet. Like she won't walk. And I
So
was like, oh, that's
that's
a
a
whole other
tactile sensitivity right there.
Exactly. She doesn't
Carpet,
like the
sand,
sensation,
grass, all of those things.
the pressure
Now,
in the joints and the muscles
yeah,
maybe. And
there's something to that though too that we have to remember is that things that are new and unfamiliar and unpredictable are also viewed by our brain as scary initially, and our
yeah.
brain goes into a fight or flight stress response as well because we're like, oh, I don't know what to make of this, especially our babies and our kids who have not experienced these before, so they don't have the
Mm,
experiences to draw on. So if it's the first time or the second time that you're putting your baby's feet in the sand, for example, and they're like, oh, I don't know about this, it may or may not be sensory processing. It might
yeah.
just be the fact that it's new. The
Okay.
same goes for if it's the first time, well, at 11 months, she's been on the carpet before. So
Mhm.
there is a little bit more of a sign of like, oh, there's something going on. Every time she goes on the carpet barefoot, she's like, nope, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's most likely a tactile sensitivity. And there's definitely things to do to help with that. And one of the things, I guess it could be seen as exposure therapy. One of the things that has been shown to really reduce tactile sensitivity in particular is a brushing protocol or a brushing
Mm.
program. And it's actually using a very, very special brush, and you're brushing the skin and you're trying to desensitize the skin. But that's a little bit different. So then by doing this brushing program, and there's like a whole protocol to it. So you're brushing the skin, you're doing joint compressions to offer that proprioceptive input to calm the potentially irritating input, with
Mhm.
the idea then that she's going to be able to process the touch input from, let's say, the carpet or
Yeah.
other things. It's probably showing up in other areas of her life as well, not just the carpet. Um, so she'll be able to process that a little bit more easily
Yeah.
versus we're going to force you to put your feet on the carpet until you get used to it, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a difference.
And I think that's where the dad was thinking, like, well, we'll just like put her on the carpet.
Yeah.
And I just say, like, no, we have to be sensitive to the baby has specific needs, but like we have
Mhm.
to like honor those needs.
Yeah.
Well, part of honoring those needs, of course, would be exploring and seeing if there are ways to manage that. So
Mhm.
that's okay. So that's really interesting that there are ways to help babies
Mhm.
learn how to better integrate their sensory experiences and
Mhm.
process them so they can live a life of
Yeah.
comfort.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And I don't want to go too much into detail on this,
Yeah.
but I do want to mention this because sometimes it gives you a good visual to think about how the sensory systems sort of work in their whole body. If
Mhm.
you think of your body as a pyramid, and the
Okay.
bottom of the pyramid is the foundation.
Yeah.
You can't have the top if you don't have the bottom. And
Mhm.
at the bottom of the pyramid, that's where our sensory systems lie. But on the very, very bottom of the pyramid are actually three sensory systems that are sort of the core sensory systems: tactile, vestibular, and proprioceptive.
Okay.
Those are the three systems that actually give us the awareness of where our body is, how
Mhm.
our body is feeling, and what our body can do in relation to ourselves, in relation to our environment, in relation to just feeling comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that those developing those senses and becoming comfortable with them is
Mhm.
part of why it's so important for like small kids to do rough and tumble play and
Mhm.
go on
Love that.
swings and go
Yes.
down the slide the wrong way and everything because it
Mhm.
helps to figure out
Uh-huh.
how to orient themselves in space, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so all of that really active play, going to the playground, swinging on the swings, going down the slides, rolling down the hill, all of this stuff playing in the mud, playing in the dirt, playing in the sand, getting really messy, doing whatever they do to explore. Encourage that in your baby. Don't be like, oh no, don't get dirty, you're gonna get dirty, right? Because we sometimes have our own sensory preferences and we put those onto our kids too. So we need to be aware of like, oh, I don't like that you're touching all that slimy stuff. I don't want to touch that.
Yes.
You have to be aware of your own preferences too, so that you're not setting the stage for your child to be like, oh no, mommy doesn't like that, so I don't like that either.
Yeah, because I also learned fairly recently that sort of, compulsively cleaning up a baby when you're feeding them, right? When you're helping them feed or they're feeding themselves and you're constantly wiping their face and their hands can lead to sensitivities, which then lead to problems with eating.
Well, yes.
Right?
So that, if you think about it, our mouth and our face is a very intimate part of our body.
Yeah.
Put yourself in baby shoes. I always tell moms to put themselves in baby shoes. What if somebody was coming at you with a spoon and just jamming things into your mouth and you were like, I don't even know what's on this spoon. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's warm, sometimes it comes fast, sometimes it comes slow. Sometimes she scrapes the spoon on my mouth. Sometimes she puts the spoon down and does something else really quickly on my mouth. You're like, whoa, what is going on? I do not like this. I'm going to push away. I'm going to start fussing. I don't want any part of this. It kind of makes sense because you wouldn't want that either as an adult, a functioning adult who probably has a functioning sensory processing system. And we have the control to say, no, I don't like that. I can feed myself. Thank you very much. Because that gives me control. And oftentimes when you do have sensory processing things going on, when you have the control, you can actually manage those senses much more easily.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the same factor. Okay, so that's something to just think about. We do that automatically because we're like, oh, we don't want you to get messy. But giving your baby the control, especially if you have a baby who doesn't like to be spoon-fed, who's fussing all the time, who doesn't seem to like solids, allow them to have some independence and wait until the end to clean their mouth. And you can actually do it with them. Give them a washcloth, like a wet washcloth, and just have them chew and rub and all this stuff. You can do imitation. There's lots of learning that can be done and developing that can be done through this imitation of having them do it themselves.
Yeah.
You might need some help, which is fine. And sometimes they'll fuss. No kid likes to have their face wiped, really. But yeah, so we want to just be careful that we're not doing all of that because there can be that learned behavior of like, oh no, I don't like this. I don't like this whole eating thing because every time I eat, I have all these things happening to my face that I don't really like.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So if parents are suspecting that, like they've gone through a checklist in their head. Okay, like, no, I'm pretty sure I'm chest feeding and I know my latch is pretty solid. And that's working pretty well. I've had a baby, maybe the baby had a posterior tongue-tie release. So I know for sure it's not specifically that's causing a problem at the moment. I'm making sure that my baby is being offered the opportunity to go to sleep. I'm paying like on kind of like sleep cycle that's appropriate for your age. And I'm looking at all of the sort of like first level stuff that it could be a problem, and I've ruled out pretty much everything. What is a parent's next step?
Well, definitely getting in touch if you do suspect sensory processing differences. Then getting in touch with a professional, a healthcare professional who has the training in sensory processing integration or sensory integration and sensory processing. And so oftentimes that is an occupational therapist that has additional training. So not all occupational therapists have the sensory integration training.
Okay.
But now, so it's like additional coursework that you have to do. Occupational therapists, sometimes speech and language therapists also will have additional sensory integration training. And I've even started to see some physical therapists as well who have that sensory integration training. And so really getting in touch with somebody who has at least some knowledge. But those ones are generally it's an occupational therapist who has the comprehensive knowledge for that. But make sure that they have the training because we don't learn that in OT school. I think I had one lesson on it. Maybe things have changed now. It's been like 14 years since I was in OT school, but we had one lesson, and
Yeah.
even then it was like, well, this like thing.
Honestly, it's like a lot of stuff, like with breastfeeding and medical school or similar
Totally.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole like, this is a thing that happens. Here's how it generally works.
Mhm.
On to the next
Yeah.
topic.
I also want to just say a little caveat to this also is
Yeah.
that, especially babies in the fourth trimester, they are going to be more sensitive. They
Yeah.
are going to startle more because they're just getting used to everything.
Mhm.
Life inside the womb was muffled, it was warm, it was gravity free. They were floating in there. They had the pressure of the amniotic fluid and mom's like all of her organs and everything pushing them, so that
Yeah.
proprioceptive pressure. They had the vestibular input. They were like rocked to sleep basically, right? So and then they come out and it's loud, it's cold, it's bright. They have to deal with gravity. Now they have to figure out how to eat. They have to digest that food. There's a lot going on in their
Mhm.
little bodies. And then you have all of the outside sensory input coming in of like clothing on their skin and bath time and it's cold and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So you also have to keep in mind that initially, especially in those first 3 to 4 months, they are going to be a little bit more like, "Ugh," because they're getting used to it. They're learning what is safe, what is not safe. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to think or jump to, oh my gosh, my baby must have sensory processing things if they don't like to have bath time, for example, when they're newborn. That's very normal.
Yeah.
um, so just keeping that in mind that it takes a little bit of time for this process called habituation to
Mhm.
happen. And what habituation is that you have the same experience over and over and over, and your brain starts to realize this is familiar, this is predictable, it's safe, it's okay, I don't have to worry about it, I don't have to pay attention to it anymore. We don't pay attention to how our clothes feel on our body for the most part. Some
Mhm.
people really feel every little movement. They feel the bands, they feel the tags, they feel all of those things. But for the most part, we've habituated to having clothes on our body, so we don't go around feeling them all day.
Yeah.
Babies need time to habituate.
Mhm.
So just keeping that in mind also. Um, Sometimes parents come to me and they're like, I think my baby has sensory processing things. And I'm like, no, your baby's actually just normal. Let's try this. And, I'll give them calming strategies, but it's not usually anything that's like a big red flag where I'm like, oh yeah, we for sure have to, do some treatment and get this sorted. Um, but follow your gut at the same time. So follow that mama instinct where if you're like, something just doesn't seem right, there's something going on,
Mhm.
then at least reach out and clarify.
Yeah.
And I do free 15-minute right fit calls, and sometimes I will say to parents, "You don't need me."
Yeah.
um,
I
Here's some strategies,
appreciate
and
folks
you
who
don't
do
need
that.
me, right?
Mhm.
Um, so my husband probably thinks I do that a little more than I should.
I know. You know what? Honestly, as a doula and as a, like a sleep consultant, I do the same thing when I talk to
Mhm.
people. I say, like, honestly, I don't think this is the right thing for you. Here
Yeah,
is what I think is right.
yeah,
Or like I think with
yeah,
a little bit of like free help, you're gonna
yeah.
be good.
Exactly. I also just want to mention, because I'm just noticing the time, but I want to mention too that another thing that can cause sensory sensitivities
Mhm.
can be primitive reflexes that haven't been fully integrated in utero or on the way out. But
Okay.
also if there's any body tightness or there's compression of the head bones, because our head bones do have to overlap in order to kind of fit through the birth canal.
Yes.
Um, but and then they generally, with sucking and feeding and all of this, they generally do come back out. But sometimes if they stay overlapped, that can lead to compression, it can lead to pain, it can lead to discomfort. If there's anything going
Mhm.
on in the gut, if there are any food allergies or intolerances, for example, um, that can lead to also pain and discomfort in the gut. And pain and discomfort or anything like that, where you're just like not feeling quite right, that can all lead to you being more sensitive to outside input.
Yeah.
So, I mean, think about yourselves when you are just like feeling under the weather and like the light is a little brighter and you're like, oh gosh, or if you have a headache and you're like, oh, I can't stand that bright light. And your partner's like, well, actually, it's just like the normal light. Or you don't want to go outside without the sunglasses because you're like, oh, it's just really bright today. Or you're just like not feeling good and you just want to
Yeah.
curl up in the dark with your nice heavy blanket on and not leave your bed. So we need to remember that it might be sensory sensitivities as a result of a different underlying condition going on.
Okay.
So whether it's body tightness, whether it's gut health related. So this is why it's really important to take a holistic perspective on what happened, how was baby in utero, what
Yeah.
happened during birth and delivery, so it's really important to kind of look at the big picture.
Mhm.
Yeah.
For sure. So usually when I see a baby who is having some issues in the sense that like often we'll have a baby who looks like their latch is really good. Maybe we've dealt with tongue ties, so oral tethers, and they've been resolved. And then we still have a baby who is like really fussing on one side
Mhm.
when they're feeding as opposed to the other side. They seem to feed really great on the right side, but we move them to
Mhm.
the left and the baby is like doesn't feed well, fusses constantly, arcs their back, and just like
Mhm.
is cranky. And so I'm always like, I wonder if we went to see a cranial sacral therapist,
Mhm.
they would be able to recognize some kind of like if there's some
Yeah.
torticollis in the neck
Mhm.
and shoulder, if there is some sort of like I always refer to it as like the oral architecture or
Mhm.
the whole skull architecture, something going on in there that if we could provide some gentle, like
Mhm.
reshaping or loosening kind of work with the
Mhm.
baby, if that wouldn't sort of magically resolve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And then you're like, okay, what's the next step?
Yeah.
Maybe it's sensory processing things going on. But just knowing that, even by providing your baby with those three bottom senses can do wonders
Yeah.
for the rest of the sensory sensitivities or under or over registering the sensory input. So focusing on the tactile, the vestibular, and the proprioceptive. So baby wearing is a great way to do that.
Mhm.
But even things like baby massage, and like I know sometimes we're like bouncing on the ball. I'm on a ball right now, but bouncing on the ball, or we're like walking around. We're like, oh my gosh, like why do I have to do all of this? Well, guess what? You're actually helping your baby calm through those sensory inputs. And
Yeah.
those three sensory inputs can be very calming for babies. This is why they like the rocking. This is why sometimes the swaddling is appropriate for babies. I know there's a whole huge controversy on swaddling, but the swaddling offers that deep pressure. And
Yeah.
sometimes when your baby is just freaking out, or maybe they are totally overstimulated and they're not calming in your arms, sometimes that swaddling is giving them that deep pressure, the touch, and it can be so comforting for them.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
and we're not leaving our babies swaddled 24 hours a day. So there's a whole other, kind of not rules, but things that you want to consider with swaddling. But that is why swaddling often works,
Yeah.
right? And so this is why bouncing on the ball works. This is why you're sitting and you're rocking your baby for hours and hours, because you're really helping them to develop those sensory systems and to start getting them working efficiently, but you're
Mhm.
also helping to maintain that calm state of like, oh, okay, I know where I am right now against mom or gravity in this world that I am in now. So there's so many little nuances. But yeah, if you do suspect that there's something else going on and you want to investigate the sensory processing side of things, I do virtual consultations for that as well.
Fantastic.
And so, what that looks like is really just I have you fill out a few questionnaires because I want to see what the big picture is. Then we get on a call and we talk things through, and I get a little bit more information if I need more clarification on certain things. And then I walk you through, okay, so here's what your baby's sort of sensory profile looks like. Here are some of the strategies that I recommend that we put into place so that we can start getting them to be in a more calm and regulated place throughout the day, so that they can then eventually start to manage those whatever they're having difficulty with, loud sounds or the diaper changes or not being able to calm enough for sleep.
Yeah.
Then we can manage those a little bit better when our system is feeling calm.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's that. Any other questions? I know, like, we just scratched the surface on this.
I know. I think maybe you should come back, and
Yeah.
then we can dive a little deeper into some of these topics. Because I think, like, helping parents understand the role of practitioners like yourself in how we can help families will actually bring a lot of comfort and relief to people who just may think that they're kind of saddled with a baby who, when their sister's baby maybe is super chilled out and following a very kind of average, moderate path of behavior, and then they have a hypersensitive, hyper-aroused baby, they can sometimes feel like they got a lemon, and that's not, like, there are ways to help parents and babies through those situations. So,
and I will say that those kids who have more of those sensitivities often are the higher needs babies. And they need more of the comforting and the supporting. And those are often the babies that are not going to do so well sleeping in the crib on their own, and so, like, understanding what's underlying your baby's needs can often help you just feel a little more calm about everything. But also, those babies are often the babies where consistency and routine play a big piece of the puzzle and really help to regulate baby as well, because then they know what's coming next. It's familiar, it's predictable, it's safe, right? And so those are also the babies who likely need to have very consistent wake windows. Maybe you're having to watch the clock instead of just their cues, because they do tend to need more sleep, especially the sensitive ones. They do tend to need more regular, like on the clock almost. But again, you have to tune into your baby while you're getting the support to understand what's going on. But tuning into your baby is so important, but just know that sometimes these babies really do need a little bit more of that predictability in their lives, because that really does help from an external way to just like, okay, it's all good. I know something's coming next. It's good. I'm safe. It's all good.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. So if viewers really enjoyed this content, we are going to, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, you're going to want to get signed up, because next week when the newsletter goes out, we're going to include that red flags printable that Kaili was talking about, so that you too can look at what's going on with your own baby and start to figure out if there are red flags that you should be delving into a little deeper, and reaching out to someone like Kaili, who thankfully does virtual consults. So that's very helpful for our folks in our Ottawa and Toronto regions. So thank you again, Kaili.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. Folks, join us again in 2 weeks. I cannot remember what the topic is going to be, but if you've been watching us before, we are always bringing you the most pertinent information that can help you have a better pregnancy, birth, and postpartum experience. So thanks for joining us. Have a great week, folks.